Let me tell you something that happened to me a few years ago, something that completely reshaped the way I live, react, and protect my peace. At that time, I was going through one of the most difficult periods of my life inside the parish. Everything felt unstable. There were constant conflicts, misunderstandings, and people openly criticizing me from every direction. I was under pressure every single day, unable to sleep properly, unable to think clearly, and slowly losing the inner calm I once had. In that state of frustration, I made a mistake that many people make when life gets chaotic. I tried to fix everything by talking more. I tried to defend myself to everyone, explain every situation, correct every rumor, and respond to every accusation. I thought that if I just clarified things enough, people would understand me and everything would settle down. But the opposite happened. The more I explained, the worse things became. The more I defended myself, the more complicated the situation grew. It was like every word I spoke added more fuel to a fire I was trying to put out. Then one day, an older priest, a man with decades of experience and a calmness that you could feel just by being near him, said something to me that I will never forget. He didn't lecture me, he didn't judge me. He simply said, "There are battles that are not meant to be fought with words. There are problems that don't get solved by explaining everything. And there is a kind of peace that only comes when you stop trying to control everything and learn to be silent before God." In that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized I had been exhausting myself trying to manage things that were never meant to be managed through constant reaction. I had confused silence with weakness, when in reality, silence can be one of the strongest forms of wisdom a person can develop. It is not about giving up. It is about choosing peace over unnecessary conflict. We live in a world where people feel pressured to respond to everything. Everyone wants to speak, defend, explain, and be understood instantly. Silence feels uncomfortable in a world addicted to noise. But in that noise, something very important has been lost. We have lost the ability to pause before reacting. We have lost the discipline of not answering every attack, not correcting every misunderstanding, and not entering every argument we are invited into. And the truth is, many of the emotional problems people carry are not created by what others do to them, but by how they react to what is done to them. A single unnecessary response can turn a small misunderstanding into a long-lasting conflict. This is why a powerful truth is written in Proverbs 17:28, which says that even a fool is considered wise when he keeps silent, and one who closes his lips is seen as understanding. That means silence has the power to completely change how a person is perceived. Sometimes wisdom is not in having the perfect argument, but in knowing when not to speak at all. Not every situation deserves your voice, and not every opinion deserves your response. From that experience, I began to understand something deeper that I want to share with you. There are things in life that you do not fix by announcing them, defending them, or explaining them repeatedly. There are changes that only work when they are done quietly, without attention, without applause, and without unnecessary conversations. Because the more you expose certain decisions to noise, the more resistance and confusion you create around them. The first thing I learned to eliminate quietly from my life was toxic relationships. When you realize that certain people consistently bring stress, conflict, criticism, or emotional exhaustion into your life, the natural reaction is to confront them directly or explain why you are pulling away. You want closure. You want understanding. You want to make sure they know how they affected you. But in most cases, that approach only creates more tension. The moment you try to explain yourself to a toxic person, you often give them more space to argue, defend, or twist the situation. Instead of peace, you end up with more emotional chaos. What I slowly learned is that the wiser approach is distance without drama. You don't need to announce that you are cutting someone off. You don't need a long conversation or emotional confrontation. You simply begin to step back quietly. You respond less, you engage less, you make yourself less available, and over time, the connection naturally weakens without unnecessary conflict. If they ask, you respond calmly and briefly, without opening new arguments or long explanations. Something simple like being busy or going through a personal phase is enough. Peace does not require a detailed justification. The second thing I learned to remove in silence was bad habits. This is something many people fail at, not because change is impossible, but because they announce it too early. The moment you tell everyone that you are quitting a habit, you create external pressure. Suddenly, people are watching you, expecting perfection, monitoring your progress. And when you slip, which is a natural part of any real change, you don't just feel the internal disappointment, you also feel public failure. That combination often pushes people to give up completely. But when you decide to change quietly, everything becomes different. There is no audience. There is no pressure to perform. There is only your personal commitment and your private struggle. If you fail, you simply try again without shame or explanation. And slowly, real transformation begins to take root, because it is not built on attention, but on consistency. Only after real progress is made does it become meaningful to share it, not for validation, but as a testimony. The third thing I had to eliminate quietly was constant complaining. This is a habit that drains more life than people realize. Complaining often feels like relief in the moment, but in reality, it reinforces the very frustration you are trying to release. The more you speak about what is wrong, the more your mind stays locked in what is wrong. It becomes a cycle that feeds itself. Scripture addresses this clearly when it says to do everything without murmuring or arguing. That is not a suggestion to complain less. It is a direction to eliminate it entirely. The shift happens when you stop turning every inconvenience into a story and start either addressing it quietly, praying about it, or letting it go when it cannot be changed. And over time, something inside you becomes lighter. Your mind stops living in resistance, and your life starts feeling less heavy. And that is where this deeper journey begins. The journey of learning that some of the most powerful changes in life are not loud at all. The fourth thing I had to learn to eliminate quietly was the expectations I carried about other people. A large part of human suffering does not come from what people actually do, but from what we expect them to do, and then feel disappointed when reality does not match that expectation. We expect our family to understand us without explanation. We expect friends to treat us exactly the way we treat them. We expect people to value us the way we value them. And when those expectations are not met, disappointment slowly turns into frustration, resentment, and sometimes even conflict. At some point, I realized that most of these emotional struggles were not caused by other people being wrong, but by me silently demanding that they behave in a way that suited my idea of fairness. The truth is, every person operates from their own mindset, history, limitations, and priorities. No matter how close someone is to you, you cannot fully control how they think, respond, or treat situations. The sooner you accept that reality, the less emotional damage you carry. Letting go of expectations does not mean allowing people to mistreat you or removing boundaries. It simply means releasing the silent demand that others must act in a certain way for you to feel okay. When you stop expecting people to change for your peace, you begin to take responsibility for your own emotional stability. You stop reacting with anger every time someone fails to meet an unspoken standard, and instead you start responding with clarity and maturity. The real shift happens when you stop having private arguments in your mind about how people should have behaved, and instead focus on how you choose to respond. This silent adjustment changes everything. You stop living in constant disappointment, and your relationships become lighter, not because people suddenly become perfect, but because you stop placing unrealistic weight on them. The fifth thing I had to eliminate quietly was the need to always be right. This is something that sounds simple in theory, but is very difficult in practice because it is deeply connected to ego. There is a natural desire in most people to prove their point, to win arguments, and to make others acknowledge that they were correct all along. But in real life, insisting on being right often costs more than it gives. I started noticing that many arguments I entered were not actually meaningful. Even when I had strong logic or clear facts, proving my point rarely improved the situation. Instead, it created distance, tension, and unnecessary conflict. There are conversations where being right does not bring peace, and peace is often more valuable than winning a debate. That is when I understood a deeper principle found in wisdom literature, that sometimes silence is the most intelligent response. Not every opinion needs correction, and not every misunderstanding needs to be resolved in the moment. There are times when stepping back from a discussion is more powerful than participating in it. Choosing not to argue does not mean you are weak or uninformed. It often means you are mature enough to prioritize peace over ego. I began asking myself a simple question before responding in heated situations. Does this argument actually improve anything in my life, or is it just feeding my need to be right? In many cases, the honest answer was that it changed nothing. The other person was not going to suddenly agree, and even if they did, it would not bring any real benefit. So I started choosing silence more often, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Over time, something interesting happened. People began to perceive me differently. Instead of seeing someone who always reacts or argues, they saw someone who does not get easily pulled into unnecessary conflict. That quiet restraint created more respect than any argument ever could. And more importantly, it protected my inner peace, which is far more valuable than temporary validation in a discussion. The sixth thing I had to remove quietly from my life was the desire for revenge. When someone hurts you, betrays you, or treats you unfairly, the emotional reaction can be very strong. There is a natural internal pressure to make them feel what you felt, to respond in a way that restores balance, or to make sure they understand the pain they caused. But acting on that impulse rarely leads to healing. Holding on to revenge keeps you emotionally tied to the very situation you are trying to escape. It keeps the hurt alive in your mind. I had to slowly understand that justice is not something I need to personally execute in every situation. There are things that are beyond personal control, and trying to fix them through retaliation only deepens emotional damage. Letting go of revenge is not something you announce or declare. It is something you decide internally. You don't need to tell the person that you are choosing not to retaliate. You don't need to present it as moral superiority. You simply release it in silence. You acknowledge the hurt, but you refuse to carry it forward as a mission for revenge. Instead, you hand it over to God, to time, or to life itself, trusting that justice does not always need your involvement. When you make that silent decision, something heavy begins to lift from your heart. Bitterness starts to lose its grip, and emotional space opens up again. You realize that revenge does not create peace, but forgiveness and release often do. The seventh thing I had to eliminate quietly was the habit of constantly apologizing for things that were not my fault. This is something many people struggle with, especially those who are sensitive, empathetic, or afraid of conflict. They say sorry for speaking, sorry for asking, sorry for needing attention, sorry for existing in a space where they have every right to be. Over time, I realized that excessive apologizing is often not about politeness, but about shrinking yourself to avoid discomfort in others. It sends an internal message that your presence is a burden, even when it is not. That is not humility. It is self-neglect. So I began changing something simple but powerful. Instead of apologizing unnecessarily, I replaced it with gratitude. Instead of saying sorry for disturbing you, I would say thank you for your time. Instead of apologizing for expressing emotion, I would simply express it calmly and respectfully, without guilt attached to it. This shift was not about becoming insensitive or arrogant. It was about learning to occupy space in the world without feeling guilty for it. You do not need to announce that you are stopping apologies. You simply begin to remove them quietly from places where they do not belong. And slowly, something changes in the way you carry yourself. You start speaking with more confidence, standing with more dignity, and interacting with others from a place of balance rather than self-doubt. And as these silent changes continue, a deeper transformation begins to form. The eighth thing I had to remove quietly from my life was the habit of oversharing everything on social media. At some point, I realized how easy it had become to turn private moments into public updates, to turn emotions into posts, and to constantly look for validation through likes, comments, and reactions. It felt normal because everyone was doing it, but I started noticing something deeper underneath it all. The more I shared everything, the less I actually experienced it. Instead of living the moment, I was thinking about how it would look online. Instead of enjoying a personal experience fully, part of my attention was always outside of it, waiting for approval from people who were not even present in that moment. Slowly, life started to feel less personal and more performative. I also noticed another hidden cost. When you share everything, you unintentionally invite unnecessary opinions, judgments, and comparisons into your life. Not everyone who sees your life online understands it, but many still feel entitled to comment on it. And those comments, even when small, start shaping how you feel about your own experiences. So I began to change quietly. I didn't announce that I was leaving social media or making any dramatic statement. I simply started posting less and living more. I began to protect certain moments as private instead of turning them into content. I learned to enjoy things fully without needing to document them for others. Over time, something powerful happened. My mind became less scattered. I stopped measuring my life through external reactions. I became more present in my own experiences. And most importantly, I started feeling a deeper sense of peace that was not dependent on online validation. The ninth thing I had to eliminate quietly was constant comparison with other people. This is one of the most silent but destructive habits in modern life, especially in a world dominated by social media. You look at someone else's life, their achievements, their relationships, their appearance, and without realizing it, you start measuring your own life against theirs. But what I slowly understood is that comparison is never fair. You are comparing your behind-the-scenes reality with someone else's carefully selected highlights. You are comparing your struggles with their edited moments. And in that process, you always end up feeling like you are behind, even when you are actually progressing. I also realized that comparison creates a kind of mental competition that never ends. There will always be someone who has more, looks better, earns more, or appears happier. So if your peace depends on being ahead of others, you will never actually find peace. Instead of announcing a decision to stop comparing, I began correcting it quietly in my mind. Every time comparison appeared, I would gently redirect my focus back to my own path, my own progress, and my own blessings. It was not about ignoring reality, but about refusing to measure my worth through someone else's life. And slowly, that shift changed everything. I started noticing progress I had previously ignored. I became more grateful for my own journey instead of feeling anxious about someone else's. My mind became less competitive and more grounded. The 10th thing I had to remove quietly was the need to always be included in everything. There is a subtle emotional pain that comes when you realize you were not invited somewhere, or when you find out people gathered without you. It can easily trigger feelings of rejection, insecurity, or even anger if you let it grow. But over time, I learned something very important. Not every space is meant for you, and not every group includes you, and that is completely normal. Your value is not defined by how many invitations you receive, or how often you are included in every plan. I had to let go of the idea that being left out always means something negative. Sometimes it simply means you were not part of that specific moment in someone else's life. And that is okay. When I stopped taking it personally, I stopped suffering unnecessarily. So instead of reacting, questioning, or overthinking, I began to let it go silently. I focused more on the relationships where I was genuinely valued and less on the situations where I felt forced to prove my importance. And with time, I noticed something important. The emotional weight of exclusion started disappearing. I stopped chasing spaces where I was not truly needed, and instead I started investing my energy where I was naturally appreciated. The 11th thing I had to remove quietly was engaging in conversations that do not build anything meaningful. These are the small but constant talks that revolve around gossip, criticism of others, negativity, and unnecessary judgment. At first they may seem harmless, but over time they slowly affect your mindset. I began to notice that the more I participated in those conversations, the heavier my thoughts became afterward. Even if I did not start them, being part of them left a subtle impact on my peace. It created noise inside my mind that stayed long after the conversation ended. So I started making quiet decisions. I did not create conflict or call anyone out. I simply chose not to participate. Sometimes I would change the topic gently. Other times I would step away without making a scene. It was a silent boundary, not a public declaration. And slowly, my environment started to feel lighter. My thoughts became clearer. I realized that protecting your peace sometimes means simply choosing not to engage, not to argue, and not to absorb unnecessary negativity. The 12th thing I had to eliminate quietly was resistance to change. This was one of the hardest ones because change often feels uncomfortable and uncertain. There were areas in my life where I stayed far too long simply because they were familiar, even when they were no longer healthy for me. I realized that I was sometimes spending more energy explaining why I could not change than actually trying to change. And in that process, I was staying stuck in the same place while convincing myself that I had no choice. The real shift began when I stopped announcing or defending my inability to change and instead started moving quietly toward it. I did not tell everyone my plans. I did not seek approval. I simply began taking small steps in a different direction. And something surprising happened. When change is quiet, it becomes harder for fear and outside opinions to stop it. By the time others noticed, the transformation had already begun. And that is where the deeper realization started forming. The 13th thing I had to eliminate quietly was the fear of what people would say. This is one of the most invisible forms of control in a person's life, because it does not feel like control at first. It feels like caution, like responsibility, like being careful. But slowly, I started noticing how many decisions were not actually mine. They were shaped by imagined reactions from others. I would pause before speaking, not because I was unsure, but because I was thinking about how it might sound to someone else. I would delay decisions, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I was mentally rehearsing how people might judge it. And without realizing it, I was living a life filtered through invisible opinions. At some point, I understood something simple but powerful. People will always have something to say, no matter what you do. If you succeed, they talk. If you fail, they talk. If you stay silent, they still talk. So living your life based on avoiding their opinions is a losing game from the beginning. So I stopped trying to manage those voices in my mind. I didn't announce that I no longer cared. I simply began making decisions more honestly, based on what I believed was right and what aligned with my values, not what would protect me from criticism. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but it slowly lost its authority, and something interesting happened over time. The same things I was once afraid to do became normal. The opinions I feared so much lost their emotional power, and I realized most people are not thinking about you as much as you think they are. The 14th thing I had to eliminate quietly was the need to explain every decision I made. I used to believe that if people understood my reasons, they would support me. So I would go into long explanations, trying to make sure everyone saw my perspective, understood my logic, and agreed with my choices. But what I learned is that explanation does not always lead to understanding. In many cases, the more you explain, the more you open space for debate, judgment, and unnecessary questioning. Not everyone needs access to the full reasoning behind your life decisions. So I started simplifying my responses. Instead of long justifications, I would give short, calm answers when appropriate. Not to be rude, but to protect my peace. If I changed something in my life, I did not feel the need to present a full report to everyone around me. And over time, I noticed something important. People actually respected my decisions more when I stopped over-explaining them. There is a quiet confidence in not needing approval, and that confidence communicates more than any detailed explanation ever could. The 15th and final thing I had to eliminate quietly was an outdated version of myself. This was not something external like habits or relationships. It was internal. It was the identity I had outgrown but still held on to out of familiarity. There were parts of me that no longer matched who I was becoming, but I kept them alive because they were comfortable, because they were known, and because others were still used to that version of me. Letting go of that old identity felt strange, almost like losing something familiar even if it was no longer healthy. But I realized that growth requires silent endings. You don't always need to announce that you are changing. You don't need to tell the world that you are becoming someone new. In fact, the most powerful transformations often happen without explanation, so I began to let that older version of myself fade quietly. I stopped reacting the way I used to react. I stopped making decisions from old fears. I stopped playing roles that no longer reflected who I was inside. And instead, I allowed my actions to reflect my growth naturally. And what I discovered is that real change does not need attention. It does not need validation. It simply becomes visible over time through consistency and behavior. When I look back at everything, I realize all these changes had something in common. None of them required noise. None of them required announcements. None of them required proving anything to anyone. They all required silence, discipline, and honesty in private moments. That is when I understood a deeper truth. The most meaningful transformations in life do not happen in public. They happen in silence, in the unseen decisions, in the private battles, and in the quiet moments where no one is watching. And the more I embraced that way of living, the more peace I found. Not because life became perfect, but because I stopped reacting to everything and started choosing carefully what deserved my attention and what did not. And that is where everything truly begins to change. In the end, I began to see that all these changes were never really about silence itself. They were about learning how to live with intention instead of reaction. Because most of the chaos in life does not come from the world around us, but from how constantly we feel the need to respond to it. The moment I stopped reacting to everything, I started noticing how much mental space I had been wasting on things that were never worth my energy in the first place. There is a different kind of strength that develops when you stop announcing your life and start living it quietly. It is not a loud strength. It does not need attention or validation. It is the kind of strength that shows up in your decisions, in your boundaries, and in your ability to stay calm when others expect you to react. That kind of stability does not come from control over others, but from control over yourself. I also realized something important about growth. Real growth is rarely recognized in the moment. When you are changing internally, the world around you may not notice immediately, but that does not make the change any less real. In fact, some of the deepest transformations happen in private, long before they become visible in public. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending every action. You stop trying to convince people that you are different. And slowly, your life itself becomes the proof. There is a verse in Matthew 6:6 that says, "When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." That principle is not only about prayer, it reflects a deeper truth about life. What is built in silence often carries the strongest foundation. What is done for approval is fragile, but what is done in private conviction becomes unshakable. When I reflect on everything I had to let go of, I understand now that none of it required drama. I did not need to announce that I was cutting people off, changing habits, or becoming a different version of myself. In fact, the less I spoke about it, the more stable the change became. Silence protected the process. It prevented outside opinions from interfering with something that needed to grow internally. And with time, something unexpected happened. Life became lighter. Not because problems disappeared, but because I stopped multiplying them with unnecessary reactions. I stopped turning every situation into a debate. I stopped trying to fix every misunderstanding. I stopped carrying emotional weight that was never mine to hold in the first place. Peace did not come from controlling everything around me. It came from releasing the need to control everything around me. That shift changed how I see relationships, decisions, and even challenges. I began to understand that not everything deserves a response. Not every situation deserves attention, and not every voice deserves access to your energy. What I once thought was weakness, I now see as wisdom. Silence is not absence of action. It is often the highest form of discipline. It is the ability to pause when everything inside you wants to react. It is the ability to step back when ego demands to step forward. And it is the ability to choose peace over temporary satisfaction. And if there is one final lesson I can share from this journey, it is this. Your life does not need to be constantly explained to be valid. Your growth does not need an audience to be real. Your transformation does not need approval to be meaningful. The most important changes in your life will often happen quietly, between you and God, in moments no one else will ever see. And yet, those are the exact moments that shape everything you become. Because in the end, the most powerful life is not the one that is loudly displayed, but the one that is quietly built, carefully protected, and deeply lived in peace.